Chapter 12 of Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Charles Dickens by G. K. Chesterton. Chapter 12. A Note on the Future of Dickens. The hardest thing to remember about our own time, of course, is simply that it is a time. We all instinctively think of it as the Day of Judgment, but all the things in it which belong to it merely as this time will probably be rapidly turned upside down. All the things that can pass will pass. It is not merely true that all old things are already dead. It is also true that all things are already dead, for the only undying things are the things that are neither new nor old. The more you are up with the year's fashion, the more, in a sense, you are already behind next year's. Consequently, in attempting to decide whether an author will, as it is cantily expressed, live, it is necessary to have very firm convictions about what part, if any part, of man is unchangeable. And it is very hard to have this if you have not a religion or, at least, a dogmatic philosophy. The equality of men needs preaching quite as much as regards the ages as regards the classes of men. To feel infinitely superior to a man in the 12th century is just precisely as snobbish as to feel infinitely superior to a man in the old Kent Road. There are differences between the man and us. There may be superiorities in us over the man, but our sin in both cases consists in thinking of the small things wherein we differ, when we ought to be confounded and intoxicated by the terrible and joyful matters in which we are at one. But here again the difficulty always is that the things near us seem larger than they are, and so seem to be a permanent part of mankind, when they may really be only one of its party modes of expression. Few people, for instance, realise that a time may easily come when we shall see the great outburst of science in the 19th century as something quite as splendid, brief, unique, and ultimately abandoned, as the outburst of art at the Renaissance. Few people realise that the general habit of fiction, of telling tales in prose, may fade, like the general habit of the ballad, of telling tales in verse, has for the time faded. Few people realise that reading and writing are only arbitrary, and perhaps temporary sciences, like heraldry. The immortal mind will remain, and by that writers like Dickens will be securely judged. That Dickens will have a high place in permanent literature there is, I imagine, no prig surviving to deny. But though all prediction is in the dark, I would devote this chapter to suggesting that his place in 19th century England will not only be high, but altogether the highest. At a certain period of his contemporary fame, an average Englishman would have said that there were at that moment in England about 5 or 6 able and equal novelists. He could have made a list: Dickens, Bulwer Lytton, Thackeray, Charlotte Brontë, George Eliot, perhaps more. 40 years or more have passed, and some of them have slipped to a lower place. Some would now say that the highest platform is left to Thackeray and Dickens. Some to Dickens, Thackeray and George Eliot. Some to Dickens, Thackeray and Charlotte Brontë. I venture to offer the proposition that when more years have passed, and more weeding has been effected, Dickens will dominate the whole England of the 19th century. He will be left on that platform alone. I know that this is an almost impertinent thing to assert, and that its tendency is to bring in those disparaging discussions of other writers in which Mr. Swinburne brilliantly embroiled himself in his suggestive study of Dickens. But my disparagement of the other English novelists is wholly relative and not in the least positive. It is certain that men will always return to such a writer as Thackeray, with his rich emotional autumn, his feeling that life is a sad but sacred retrospect, in which at least we should forget nothing. It is not likely that wise men will forget him. So, for instance, wise and scholarly men do from time to time return to the lyrists of French Renaissance, to the delicate poignancy of Du Bellay. So they will go back to Thackeray. But I mean that Dickens will bestride and dominate our time, as the vast figure of Rabelais dominates Du Bellay, dominates the Renaissance and the world. Let me put a negative reason first. The particular thing for which Dickens is condemned, and justly condemned, by his critics, are precisely those things which have never prevented a man from being immortal. The chief of them is the unquestionable fact that he wrote an enormous amount of bad work. This does lead to a man being put below his place in his own time. It does not affect his permanent place, to all appearance at all. Shakespeare, for instance, and Wordsworth wrote not only an enormous amount of bad work, but an enormous amount of enormously bad work. Humanity edits such writers' works for them. Virgil was mistaken in cutting out his inferior lines. We would have undertaken the job. Moreover, in the particular case of Dickens, there are special reasons for regarding his bad work, as I have previously suggested, under a kind of general ambition that had nothing to do with his special genius, an ambition to be a public provider of everything, a warehouse of all human emotions. He held a kind of literary day of judgment. He distributed bad characters as punishments, and good characters as rewards. My meaning can be best conveyed by one instance out of many. The character of the kind old Jew in Our Mutual Friend, a needless and unconvincing character, was actually introduced because some Jewish correspondent complains that the bad old Jew in Oliver Twist conveyed the suggestion that all Jews were bad. The principle is so light-headedly absurd that it is hard to imagine any literary man submitting to it for an instant. If ever he invented a bad auctioneer, he must immediately balance him with a good auctioneer. If he should have conceived an unkind philanthropist, he must on the spot, with whatever natural agony and toil, imagine a kind philanthropist. The complaint is frantic, yet Dickens, who tore people in pieces for much fairer complaints, like this complaint of his Jewish correspondent. It pleased him to be mistaken for a public arbiter. It pleased him to be asked, in a double sense, to judge Israel. All this is so much another thing, a non-literary vanity, and there is much less difficulty than usual in separating it from his serious genius, and by his serious genius, I need hardly say, I mean his comic genius. Such irrelevant ambitions as this are easily passed over, like